The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to another National Road Safety Partnership Program webinar, changing how we change and overcoming resistance to introducing new policies. So, my name is Jerome Carslake. I manage the NRSP and its many activities. To find out more about our program, if you can just go to the next slide, please, Daniel. You can go to our website, register for the newsletter, and you'll be kept up to date. So, today's session is approximately going for 60 minutes with plenty of time for discussion throughout. Daniel and I want to have quite an interactive discussion, so we'll be feeding questions in where they fit. And we'll also be recording this session, and it will be shared through the NRSP website should you want to follow up later on with it. We certainly love your input, so please send through your questions, typing into the question box. And now we're going to dive into our presenter. So, Daniel Abbas, welcome to you.
Good morning, Jerome.
So Daniel works extensively on disruptive technology business models and the alignment of expectations and social acceptance. His background is in technology and strategy consulting. He's established 2 education technology startups that feature in the AFR Fast Starters. That's a great accomplishment. And has advised leading companies in Australia and internationally. Daniel is the director responsible for technology innovation at FutureEye. He's an ideal person to establish a program of work to test the marketplace and inform development of product and corporate strategy. So, and before we dive in, I just want to say one thing. I want everyone to realise that, unfortunately, there is no silver bullet for change management. Would that be a fair statement, Daniel?
Look, I think it is. And what we're hoping to do today, and thank you very much, Jerome, I'm delighted to be here, is to really sort of step through what our experience with change, some of the conventional wisdom around change, and you'll see from the slide that I've had a background in strategy and change management, and also with Curio in terms of major change, in terms of new disruptive business models, and more recently with social license work. What I'd like to do is reflect on conventional change and then look really at the social license perspective and what it may have to offer us in terms of change. So we can't promise any silver bullets, but what I'm hoping is a very informative and helpful addition to what is already out there in terms of change management theory.
Great. First question, I guess, what is social license?
That's a very good question, Jerome. Thank you. So social license, put very neatly, is managing the gap between what society expects of you and what you're actually doing. More broadly, it's a question of in the way people think about it, and there's been some media around social license more and more recently with relation to things like governance principles and so forth. Are we in deficit? Are we meeting society's expectations, and therefore, if we're not, do we have a risk, or are we in fact exceeding society's expectations, and therefore we have a level of social license resilience in the sense that this community really trusts us and likes what we're doing? And that's how we think about social license in a very simple way.
Great. So how does it fit with organisational change?
Look, that's a good question. So a big part of, and that's the question that we're going to explore. So how can we apply the lessons of social license to organisational change? So if you think about what social license is doing, really, it's looking at how do we close the gap between what society is expecting of us and what we're actually doing. And there are different mechanisms available to people. There's strategies, policy, internal change management programs that follow. So then the question is, to what extent do we as an organisation, what is our ability to meet the expectations of society? And if you want to think internally, what is our ability to meet the expectations of our own staff? So how do we design our policies? How do we design our change so that it brings everybody along? What I thought I might do, just before I jump ahead, is I'm going to really do three things today. I'm going to, first of all, I thought it'd be useful for us to reflect on some of the conventional change management theory, and look at where where some of the strengths of those things are, and where there are some things that sort of leave us hanging a little bit, and where social license might fill in some of the blanks for us. So we'll do that first, and it'll be a very quick, if you like, overview of some of the conventional social change management wisdom, and then we'll look at how social license can help build our understanding and offer us some practical lessons that we might take forward.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Great.
So the first one that I wanted to look at is this quote: "Leaders establish the vision for the future and set the strategy for getting there." That's Cotter. So that's an older change management framework, but essentially it's a framework that's known as being quite a top-down approach. Now, vision is important, so that's something that we might want to pick out of this and keep and say, look, that is a very useful thing. But one of the challenges with this type of thinking is that it can be difficult to bring everybody with you. Comes across as what we would refer to as a hero status, and I'll explain what that means a little bit later. Similarly, there's other methodologies like this, the Patterson-Connor commitment curve, which is useful because it helps you understand and predict where you might have people rejecting the change. But ultimately what this one is all about is making a decision, implementing it, and trying to make it stick.
Great.
There's almost a tranche. The second tranche, what I refer to as simply as U-curve methodologies. And really they're all very similar. They all have a similar pattern, at least. They start off with this sort of building a compelling case for change, essentially to let go of the status quo. Some people even use terms like unfreezing, which it can be useful because it's an easy way to remember it. But they each descend into this sort of change chaos or change. They use different language. You might say there's anger, bargaining, depression in the middle of some of these processes, resistance, chaos. I've even heard it as a trough of disillusionment, and then you rise up at the end of the change process and try to refreeze or establish a new beginning or a shift to a new way of working. Look, I think these are helpful because they help people understand what's going on, but they don't, generally speaking, offer a lot of assistance in terms of knowing how to do these things. But it does offer a level of, I think, Jerome, of reassurance when you see that things are happening around you and you want to have faith that you are going to be able to emerge from the other side.
And because consistent within each of these, though, is illustrating just, I guess, change is tough, yeah?
Change is tough. That's right. There's a third one that I'd like to touch on, and this one you can think of this as, and look, this is an extremely powerful technique, more than a methodology, and this is what you might know as nudge theory, behavioural economics, choice modelling. It's more of an interventionist approach to enacting change. The basic idea here is that you construct the environment in such a way where you bring about change through what is sort of nicely called nudging. There are you can see that there's one there. This is often manifested through a technique called choice architecture. So you can see the three coffee cups, which is sometimes referred to as a decoy approach. So if you say to people, restaurants are known to do this. If you have a very expensive item, they don't actually expect you to buy it. They expect you to buy the second most expensive one. It's an intentional ploy to get you to buy the one that they want. But as somebody who's bootstrapped a couple of startups, with very little money to start off with, this is a very attractive change management technique because it enables you to do things at a very low cost if you're clever about it. The most famous example, it's a bit of a silly example, in an airport in Amsterdam, somebody had the idea, well, why don't we just paint a fly on the urinal to stop the mess? What does that mean? Well, they painted a little fly on the urinal and they found that people aim for it. So those that use urinals on this call may be able to relate to the effect of that.
So you got something to target.
You got something to target. So that's an example of saying, well, there was no sign up. They didn't have to do a sort of any kind of spend much money. It's an easy way to do things. Now the challenge with this methodology is it's a highly nuanced technique, and it requires a great level of skill, and it's quite an ask of people for which change management is part of their job, not a dedicated profession. And I would almost argue you need a master of psychology to be able to do it very effectively.
And is that one of the reasons why it's quite hard for some organisations to bring change about? Do they think anyone can do it, or do they just dive in?
Look, I think being able to understand the nature of the change challenge and then being able to act in a proportional and appropriate way is really the hard part. Because if you know what you're dealing with, then you can have a discussion around the table about, well, what is the proportional amount of resources, effort do we need to bring in experts? Can we manage this ourselves? You're able to have those conversations, which then make it a lot easier. So you really need to understand what's going on around you, and why is this a significant change? And that's really why I thought social license techniques might have something to offer there. So Jerome and I caught up and we said, well, there are a lot of things that are central to social license in terms of understanding of what is going on around you that would help people through a change process. And the two things that I want to cover today or step through with the audience is helping us understand the nature of resistance. I think you really need to understand what's going on, and there are a number of very good ways of doing that already, but this is an additional perspective which I find very helpful.
But why is that so important?
Well, it's a little bit like strategy formation. If you fail to have a good diagnosis of everything that's going around, whether it's a PESEL diagnosis or any other type of diagnostic that you might apply, if you don't apply several different lenses to a problem, then you won't get several different perspectives, and without those different perspectives, you may end up with some blind spots and not be able to explain what's going on, and you may formulate a strategy that doesn't address those blind spots. And that's where, as you said before, change suddenly feels very hard, because there are things happening that you haven't been able to explain and haven't been able to anticipate.
And that can lead to disaster in the future, I guess.
That can lead to disaster in the future, or at least derail things somewhat. And on that, I mean, and the importance of an effective change management process is that, and you see this happening, people develop change toolkits for their organisations or for their industry group, or across potentially even a government as a standard. It is important that there's a language and a process that people understand. So I thought I would share the structured process that we use in social license because of the way that it helps address resistance.
Great. So is there a one-size-fits-all?
There's not a one-size-fits-all, but there is one philosophy that I think goes a very long way, and that is when in overcoming resistance, it's as much about how you introduce the change as what the change is.
Great. Let's learn more.
Okay, let's jump in. Okay, so Jerome is looking at me quizzically. What is this thing? So this might not be what you expect to see first up when we're talking about change management. Let me explain what this rather complicated looking thing is. This is a diagnostic tool that we use in social license to diagnose society's values and expectations. And if it's helpful, then think about this as maybe this is the values and expectations of your own organisation, and as it relates to a particular question. So along the left, there are different stages that we see issues and questions go through. So they emerge, they become better known. You're able to frame the challenge, and then there's a response, and the response may be a government regulation, an internal policy response, might be for organisations, it might be a strategy, And that's what we call the governance phase. And then moving from there, you move into something that we call the normative phase. So let me pick up.
So I'll give you an example. So just a thought for you. So what about, as an organisation, you're bringing in zero tolerance for alcohol?
Yes, so that's an excellent example. So if you were to, well, let's talk about more broadly about the introduction of or the banning of drink driving. I'm not sure exactly when that came in. Jerome, do you know?
Well, we're flashing back in time a little bit for that.
Right. So eminently sensible thing to do, banning drink driving. But I do recall that the idea of if you drink and drive, you're a bloody idiot, right? Was the expression. But there was a second part to that sentence that you heard bantered around bars or pubs, which I won't repeat because I don't want to reinforce it, which then said that really demonstrated what the social norm or view was, maybe not of all of society, but of some subcultures of society and their view to whether or not it's okay to drink drive. And that was some time ago. So clearly what was happening there was the policy was designed to lead us to a much better outcome by banning drink driving, but whatever it was 30 years ago, that wasn't necessarily consistent with what
social norms
were. So it wasn't really at a normative stage. If I grab another example, if I can try that, you see some advertising these days where there are a group of guys sitting around and they're essentially telling off one of the other guys at the table for what appears like domestic violence over the phone. He's talking to somebody and it sounds like he's being abusive. And the people around the table are essentially telling him off. And what the advertisement is clearly trying to do there, in my view, is establish that it is a social norm that you should not be treating people like that. That is not okay. And a number of advertisements along these lines are trying to reinforce the power of social norms. And social norms are fantastically valuable for us because that's the point where, and in change management theory, you'll hear the importance of social contracts. So that's where the person next to you is just as likely to police things as management because that's the accepted point of view. People start repeating in a strong culture that is reinforcing a policy for a change. In a strong culture, they will use stories and symbols to reinforce a point of view. So they will repeat a story that very powerfully makes the point, and the culture becomes self-sustaining because that is the expectation now that change has taken hold.
So that we're seeing that right now. We're living through the big change that's coming forth.
That's right, and this you can really apply this to a great many things. So if you think about this can happen in different ways. If you take the recent discussion around gay marriage, so I think the government found out quite quickly that perhaps it was not in the governance phase, it was not in the challenge phase, but it was very much as in the normative phase, at least for the majority of people, not everybody. So your ability to understand what is going on around you and the size of the gap between what the culture or even subculture of your organisation and even potentially versus external cultures, such as broader societal expectations, is really important because that gives you a sense of the size of the challenge.
Is that where a bit of the us versus them is sort of breaking down that sort of, I guess, those silos? Would that be correct? Well,
it's interesting. So I'll answer that by referring to this chart. So let me explain what this chart's all about. This is saying, well, if we accept that that society expects something from us, and we're trying to close that gap, or lead change through strategy, policy, regulatory intervention, then we also need to be able to execute. And if you take community expectations across this x-axis and then your internal ability to execute on the y-axis, then what is really happening here is being able to diagnose, well, how well can we execute on this change? Like, how well do we match up in terms of the way that we're thinking about what we're doing versus what people expect from us? And this is particularly acute in industry groups. And it's acute on for two reasons. One is typically industry groups have been doing what they've been doing for some time. And unfortunately for them, in some ways, societal values and expectations are not fixed; they shift over time. So they might be looking at something that they've been doing forever, and they can be caught somewhat unawares that expectations have shifted. But internally, in their strong subculture, they are blind to that because they have a very strong view anchored in the past of how they do things.
It sort of reminds me of, I guess, one of those sayings is like Melbourne having a large Greek population. Our Greeks are more Greek than the Greeks, because
somebody said something along those lines to me before. Because of was this something to do with that theory that when people departed a culture, they tried to perpetuate that culture for longer.
They hold on to it.
They hold on to it, yeah.
And they remembered it as it was always like that back in the day, whereas countries continue to evolve, exactly what we're talking about now.
Well, it does contribute to a stronger sense of identity and the strength that people can draw from that. The other side of industry groups that are, which I find interesting, is they're not a traditional organisation in that you have a lot of direct control over them, right? They're member-based or association-based. So then what you're doing there is you've got a much bigger change challenge, because you're trying to represent and, if you like, broker this community expectations and internally this membership base of associations of which you have no direct control.
And their values will be very solid, and quite often they have their livelihoods are reliant on it as well.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So it's quite that one can be quite a challenge. And look, a good example that I'm able to at least mention, because it was in the media not long ago, was the live export industry. So the live export industry, I think we saw how quickly the furore over social media are built up, and whilst there will be different levels of sort of shock within the industry as to that reaction, a great number of them have been doing the same thing for a very, very long time and essentially hadn't realised just the size of the shift of community expectations. Now, enacting change, and Simon Crean was reported in the media, I think late last year, of saying, look, we didn't heed the lessons from the work that we did out there in 2014, which highlighted some of these challenges, because really your ability to respond to close that gap is limited by essentially your ability to persuade and make the change internally and across your members. So in this case, and in the case of this graph, that led to a destruction of reputation or and on top of that, commercial issues, because what that does is it says, well, there's such a gap here that it leads to a regulatory intervention, which is, of course, what happened. So this starts to show the connection between the challenges of change management and understanding what's going on.
Is the line as fine as what it is there falling between build reputation to destroy reputation? Is it the line that tight?
Look, it's not, and this goes to your point about or question about one size fits all. As we go through some of the things that we can look to apply, most of them are spectrums, and it depends on how acute your diagnostic is. So if you think the situation is quite acute, there are large gaps between how your staff and society view you and just the size of the challenge, then you will have to take more dramatic action, we find.
Okay.
So it's not black and white. So when you're trying to introduce a policy, so just say you want to introduce a response, so you've realised that that there's potential operational risk, because operational risk is essentially that gap, and for some organisations that is the risk of regulatory intervention. Then the temptation is to introduce a policy and then sell the benefits, to essentially and then overpower those that don't agree with you. If I relate this back to the Kotter view of change management, that is that it's all on management to set the strategy, define the vision, and build momentum and make it stick. That's some of the language you'll hear used across those styles of change management. And the temptation here is to say, well, look, the facts say that this is a very powerful reason to change. But of course, it doesn't factor in the human element, and there's a risk of being out of touch with the views of the people in the organisation. So much so that it can be viewed as an irrational resistance. So I'm an engineer originally, and what I've found very useful is having a way of thinking about and tackling irrationality, like this idea that people are people and you never know what they're going to do, right? That you might hear that refrain sometimes. Oh, look, you just can't predict what people are going to do, right? And what I'm hoping that we can do here is start to talk about, well, how do you predict how people are going to view things through what it might otherwise be written off as some sort of irrational response to change? Now, if I was to define irrationality as, given facts, should people respond in a predictable way? And the answer is actually no, right? And that's because when you think about how people are going to respond, there's a perception or a psychological response that you want to understand. And people will actually block out or not be responsive to this compelling case for change or the facts, as they were, unless you address outrage first.
So you're saying here, so if I present evidence on something which might be counter to what I believe in, I'll get my back up and probably dig myself in further?
Absolutely. So if I said to a person that was on social media and quite rightly upset about what they've seen around live exports, and I said, oh, by the way, did you know that cattle are safer on ships than in the field? That's not going to go down well, whether it's a fact or not. So unless you can address outrage first, and I think people know this intuitively, and I'm sure the listeners say, well, of course, you need to calm people down, you need to draw out in the conversations, but sometimes you don't have the luxury of those individual conversations. So it's, what is our communication? What are our communications? How do we build that into our communications?
There's a great comment here from Paul. To understand perception, one has to have empathy to help understanding.
Empathy is absolutely critical. That's an excellent point. So let's if we can, we'll jump to the next slide where we're going to look at some work by Peter Sandman, who essentially through his work on risk communications said, well, what are these drivers of outrage? In other words, what are these human reactions to essentially injustices? Now, there are various forms of resistance. There are various forms of resistance other than outrage triggers, and it's really important to remember these. And again, I'm not trying to provide a holistic, full, complete picture of all things. Some of these would be ideology, long-standing revenge, resentment, that sort of stuff, self-esteem issues, greed, these sorts of things. You also want to make sure that you've got your incentives aligned, and I'm sure we'll come back to that as we start thinking about how to tackle some practical road-related challenges. How do the incentives line up? But the outrage triggers is a really, I find, useful lens and diagnostic that we can apply. So in the 1 through 5 in that little square there are the ones that feature most heavily and probably have the most power behind them. Control. Who has control in the situation? So this is this relates to, well, if this decision is being made and impacts on me, then how, what level of commitment do you expect from me, given that I had no control over this? And we each can probably relate to some of these things in our own lives. This is what the nudge and choice architecture in particular is trying to tackle and see off at the pass, is this notion of control.
Is that where fear can come from a lot from people?
Well, fear. I mean, fear is a broader word than some of these things, but dread is one that might relate to fear. So how bad could this be? So there's a tendency to catastrophize.
What's the worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario. So, and there are some techniques that we'll talk about how to see that one off as well. So fear is part of it. It's the uncertainty question, which is down in number 5 as well. Do we know what could happen?
And Kelly raises a really interesting point. I think we can look at some of these triggers. So how might you address the outrage for introducing a zero BAC for all drivers?
How might you address it?
Because there were a lot of triggers. I could see that drawing a lot of that sort of, a lot of those 12 that would flow into that. Well,
let's maybe you can, as you know the subject matter better than I do, not to suggest that you know much about blood alcohol, of course. But if you were to adopt what Paul is saying on the line about adopting empathy, and then applying it to Kelly's question, then what would be a person that's in the situation that you would need to address their outrage? What would they be thinking?
I can't go out and have a few drinks with my friends and drive safely home. What happens if I just have a drink after work and get home? Well, because it's especially for alcohol, it's part of our culture. I can't even have one drink.
So it's partly the difference between when you're on the job and when you're not on the job, is that?
And that's a good question. And should an organisation have a higher expectation? How do they deal with that if they introduce a zero tolerance? And some organisations are doing that when they go, but the BAC is 0.05. Why should my organisation have a tougher stance on that?
And I think Kelly's followed it up by saying, look, why can't I even have one drink? Right? And so then there's a question about, well, what is the policy objective? So what are you trying to achieve with the policy? Is that the full story? Because if you frame this as something as simple as that, because there is the outrage response to things is to make things into a black and white situation. The fact-based thing is to examine grey areas and to break things down and to look at things as they interconnect. So when looking at this, you would need to understand, well, what is the language in that policy? How is it, and we'll talk about this process, how is it acknowledging what we've discovered by adopting empathy for this person's view and running it through these things? How does it acknowledge that? And how does it address that concern? And we will, if I promise to the listeners, come back to a method for doing that.
It's coming up.
I'll be very interested to hear if anyone on the line wants to relate anything to these outrage triggers. I appreciate the one from Kelly.
Well, David makes one here. Many large organisations use a prosky as a well-established approach that works well. What is different here?
We might get David to spell out the acronym. So.
If you do that, David, we'll throw that back at Daniel as we keep moving along.
No, I mean, quite obviously, it's a methodology. And look, maybe it's not different. I don't know prosky, so I can't answer that, David. But I will press on, and great. I would love to hear you say if there is any differences. If not, then I think we should all be looking up prosky. Okay. All right. So now, if we say these are some diagnostic techniques, then the question is, well, how do you then think about applying what we know into some sort of set of tools or process that can complement whichever change management toolkit, whether it's prosky or others, that you've adopted organisationally. You'll notice the picture there. The picture's from the movie Inception, and there that is almost the nirvana. If you can achieve change management where it's, in this movie, so essentially what happens is they realise that to bring about a change, they need to convince somebody that it's their own idea, right? And so that it deeply connects with their own sense of values, that it's something that they've thought of, and that they want to see happen and will see through.
So I think a good segue there. I remember I was chatting with one head of safety from an organisation, and the question they were looking to do is bringing in a mobile phone policy. And what his conversation with his employees was, can you give me an example of one time when you've been on the phone whilst driving where you've cracked a big sale? Or do you think when you're driving, the fact that you're focusing 60% of your time on driving and 40% on the client, do you think that's a good image for the organisation? And I said, if you can demonstrate both of them, it doesn't matter. Happy to support the mobile phone policy. If not, what do you think is the best path forward? And the workers then came up and when they pondered on it, actually came through and they said, I don't think we should be making calls to our clients or at all whilst driving. And they arrived at the decision, and then the company implemented it.
I mean, that's a good example of a couple of techniques at work, which is to give a sense of control. Now, I don't want people on the line thinking that it's ever a case of, that it's ever okay to have an internal mobile policy that is not going to lead to good safety outcomes. But sometimes control can be around what you would call the negotiable side of things. There's typically negotiables and non-negotiables. Sometimes it's how something's implemented, and some of the things around the edges of the policy. So I'd like to talk about the genuine conversation as a basis for change management. So we're talking a little bit about control, and look, there's a lot of information on this slide, so let's pick it apart so that we can understand what's going on. So the bigger the gap between that you need to address, that you came up with in the diagnostic between what people are expecting, where people are at, and the change in which you're trying to bring about, then the further up this ladder you need to go. Like, just to put it crudely, the further up this ladder you might be wise to go. So what we have here is really a spectrum that goes from the bottom section is really around one-way consultation, which hopefully people haven't experienced too much of in their lives. It's a very frustrating process. I went through a little bit of that with some recent SkyRail stuff. But anyway, and then moving into sort of higher level, more productive, if you like, co-creation style control sharing. Now, why do you share control? And we've sort of touched on most of it, which is trying to shift a sense of ownership away from management onto the staff. And why do you do that? Well, because we want to move into that normalisation stage, and we want to tap into the great power of social norms, social contracts, and a culture that is in line with the change we're trying to make. So it might be useful for people to reflect on where their organisation sits, not just internally between decision makers and people implementing those decisions, but also with, and this can be often more challenging, with suppliers and important stakeholders. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering. So does this vary depending on the type of policy you're trying to do, or would you say this is pretty consistent?
I said the main predictor is, look, some organisations will adopt a certain position because that's the culture of their organisation. Some people will realise that a position no longer serves them because they've got too much ground to make up in terms of the size of the change. So if you've got a big gap between what you want, what you want to happen and what is currently happening, then you would say, well, we need to. Our traditional approach of informing people after the fact is not going to work. There's just too much of a deficit here with the people. We need to reset and need to think about shifting to a different posture. but of course, you don't want to be seen to flip flop and be inconsistent either. So there's almost a, I think the expression is a come to Jesus moment where you might say, look, we just can't operate like this anymore. We need to involve people in the decision making in a genuine way.
Mark is asking, do shock adverts help to make change, and if so, how?
Look, I'm not an advertising expert. I've heard that they can have a desensitization effect and a resentment effect, but I decline to comment. Really, I don't really know. And I'd hate to say something that would, misinform people. I've heard that they're very effective. I just don't know that it's a bump or if it's a sustained thing. We tackle a similar question with when we're asked about PR campaigns, particularly those where organisations are trying to buy a social license, where they come out and they showcase all the wonderful things they do for the community, when we know that it's not a resilient social license, it's like a temporary bump, and then you are ultimately judged in terms of alignment of what you're actually doing versus what your expectations are.
With an election coming up, we always see them in the prelude to them.
Well, yep. I won't comment on that too much. So this may be a useful thing to reflect on. I'll talk about how we bring this together into a process in a minute. We've got another question. There's a comment to have. I'm sorry, Jerome, I might be taking your role in this.
No, process. That's all right. Dive on in.
It is common to have an organisational implement change which is contentious, yes, where some stakeholders at the same level of impact support and others are against. How can you use social license to get everyone on board? Well, what I would say is we're going to talk about a process called Dave a little bit later on, and that process will cover that.
You're like Dave.
Dave's good.
Dave's
good. So the short answer, which we'll come back to, is that you need to expose all those views and encourage dissenting views in that process.
All right.
Can you be trusted? I'm not talking to you, Jerome, because you can be trusted. So part of the process of change is trust, which we all know to be true. So the bottom three are, they sound like they're like, why would you ever do those, right? But it's not whether you're doing them; it's whether or not you are bending things. If you remember what we were saying about this desire to focus on the positives and overpower people, there is a tendency to disregard or spin negative truths, and misleading can often be perceived as just omitting information, telling part of the story that's favourable for the change that you want. So it's not misleading and spin doctor are actually not uncommon to find in terms of the relationship between decision makers and other people. So again, it's important for organisations to understand, well, how are we viewed on this ladder?
Do you think that some of the decrying that you see out there around calling fake news and those sort of things is trying to play to that sort of misleading spin doctoring sort of approach?
Well, they try to, but what we can talk about, let's talk about this thing, because this thing might be able to help us answer that. The communication seesaw. So the way in which you message change is critical, because that's where it starts. Where is that first point of contact? And the interesting thing about it is that it's counterintuitive. So the more you address the concerns or the risks, so if you think about that trust thing, and the more you talk about the negatives of the change that you're trying to introduce, or acknowledging the negatives, the more that staff will focus on the benefits. Sounds a bit counterintuitive.
No, I think it's spot on. I always argue the case: if you make a mistake, own up to it, and it just puts it out straight away.
So it reminds me of I was listening to Eddie Izzard 2 weeks ago. He's a comedian, and he's got a stick on well, the first thing he does when he goes to a party is he walks around breaking things and then admitting to it very loudly and publicly. just to demonstrate the strength of his character.
It's one way to be memorable.
It is one way to be memorable. He's actually running for Parliament. He said he wants to run for Parliament in 2020. So let's hope that he doesn't carry that one through. The more you accept responsibility, the less you are blamed. So if you're acknowledging all of the things that you've done, just like Eddie Izzard, then the less likely you are to be blamed for the outcomes.
Okay.
The more you focus on the catastrophic worst case scenarios, the more people will focus on how unlikely those scenarios are.
Which is that climate change argument.
It's climate, yeah, well. So this creates a shift in support. So the people that disagree, let's focus on the people that disagree with you. They say, look, they will say, we've found, is that I'm glad you can see the importance of their points of view, their objections, and that they told us that and we've acknowledged it. I'm more likely to consider your point of view now. So if you take mobile phone, we've talked a little in the past about a mobile phone challenge. Well, how do you, I mean, of course, you should not use mobile phones. Even touch mobile phones really, or even hand-free kits are in question on the roads. But but what is it that you might need to acknowledge? So are you acknowledging, what would that conversation look like? Would people say, I'm glad that you can see the importance of me, that I'm on the road a lot by myself. It's hard to stay in touch with family, especially around kids' bedtime and other things. I'm glad that you've acknowledged that. I'm more likely now to consider what you're saying. So that is just a very simple and apologies for those people that spend a lot of time thinking about this, a very quick reference to something that might relate to people and what they're thinking about. Ultimately, it's challenging, and it's not. And we find that this is a leadership challenge, and the reason why it's a leadership challenge is because it's a question of vulnerability. How vulnerable are you willing to be in your conversations? Now, the language here may not resonate with people. The hero, the misunderstood victim, the distracted deity. These are very melodramatic, but they may not relate to people when they're thinking about how they deal with their staff, but they may. So if you look at the hero, that is the most attractive posture for management, again, relating to that sort of Kotter idea. It's management's role to work out where we're going and how we're going to do it, what policies we need to implement, what those policies look like and how we implement them. But that means you own it all, right? It means that you tend to sell the benefits. People don't necessarily trust you necessarily. The more effective postures, and these are the ones that you tend to adopt when the gap is quite large or the ask of the change is quite large, where you start to say things like, the repentant sinner, we're going to do better. We don't always get our policies right. In the past, we haven't involved the right people. We're determined to do better. That sort of language, which really has an impact, as you can imagine, if you think about how you would feel in that situation with that sort of language.
And I guess that's a really, from a management point of view, it can be quite tough because a lot of them be achievers. They want to get things done. They want to say, look what I've accomplished. I've got a goal. I can see the outcome I want. So I just want to dive in and get into the doing.
Well, that's right. And particularly when they've got their own views about what the answer might be, right? And feel the pressure to have a view of, you can't just put out a problem and say, look, we need an answer, and we don't have any answers. That is challenging for people, right? Even if they do have the answers, to resist the temptation to volunteer the answer and without creating the space for people to be able to arrive at on their own is quite challenging for leaders. Yeah. Nicola on the line says she can't wait to meet Dave. Let's talk about Dave. So if we bring together these notions, so we talked about our diagnostic. We talked about understanding the size of the change gap. We talked about understanding some of the outrage triggers, particularly control, particularly trust, and some of the other things. We know that there are there's a need for a simple change management toolkit, and you will have one in your organisation perhaps. But there's also a way to think about how to have the conversations, and that's where I think this thing comes in. And let's talk about DAD first. So DAD means you decide on the policy or change, you announce it, and then you defend it, or the way that usually manifests itself is you sell the benefits of it and try and overpower people with those benefits.
I think that's something we see quite often.
That's something quite often, and again, we could see from the previous slide that's an attractive posture. People feel like they, these quotes, like, they're not wrong, they're just well used, where, if you want to go fast, go by yourself. If you want to go further, go together, that sort of stuff. That's where this DAD works against some of those philosophies. The second one, Dave's our mate, is, well, the first thing to do is to start the conversation at the start. So you say, and focus, and this Dave process is focusing on the how you form the policy, is declare the dilemma at the start, at the heart of everything, every gap between what people are expecting and what you want them to do is a dilemma, a genuine dilemma. People, for us, and we tackle these all the time, where you're saying, well, look, one set of views believe this, but at the same time, there are a whole series of reasons why that's challenging for other people. And sometimes it can feel like there's a lose-lose or a win-lose type situation and no win-wins. And there may not be a win-win situation. But the key is to acknowledge each of the sides so that you can take advantage of the seesaw, the psychological seesaw. If you can take advantage of the psychological seesaw, then what you effectively do is you start to affect the right people in the organisation or in the industry, or even if you're tackling a societal change more broadly in government. For example, we just recently released a report on sustainable agriculture for the Department of Agriculture, which acknowledged a whole series of issues on the farmers' side, on animal welfare side, and a whole range of other things, which elevates the conversation and says, okay, well, we've acknowledged those things, we've cleared the air on those things. And this is why it's so critical, to come back to Nicola's question about things that are contentious, to involve a great range of views on the topic. I'm doing something at the moment on ethical AI, and we're bringing together civil society activists, unions, industry leaders, government, other groups, intentionally to bring together as many different views as possible on the topic, because you do want to air that, because what you want to do is you want to build into your messaging a way of acknowledging and addressing those psychological outrage factors.
So just by simply giving them a voice and hearing and listening to them.
Look, it is.
And sharing it with the other peers as well.
So one of the things with, if we saw in that consultation letter earlier, is there is this notion of pro forma consulting, which is unfortunately probably most people's experience with being consulted, is that they're given a voice, but how's that reflected? How's that reflected in what goes out? So a technique that we would use is we think about how to influence audiences. People would think about, well, who do we talk to first? And the classic way is thinking about an upside-down U-curve. On the left, you've got the people that agree with you. On the right, people that disagree with you. And then you've got the middle part, which you'll battle for. It's almost the way that people conceptualize politics sometimes, the middle ground. The way that we look at it on an issue basis or a change basis is to say, well, who are the most highly involved? And then from there, and they're your core group. Highly involved, but with very differing views. Because they're also the ones that are the most authoritative and the ones that will have the most influence in your organisation or outside. And then after that, the attentive people, and then there'll be people that we regard as browsers or barely engaged with the issue.
And is it that vocal majority, like that 5% that can be really vocal? What chance have you got to influence them?
So you want to involve all perspectives. You don't need to. This isn't a sort of a pander to everybody in that way. So you don't say, well, because you've got the loudest voice, and that means that we're covering all of those people. But in a way that's true. You say, well, who are the people that are most involved in this issue?
Okay.
Yep. So vision is critical. So together you build a vision. Now this sounds a bit nebulous, but I'm sure we'll get into some more specifics in some of the questions. We get into the vision, and then this is unlikely. What I would say then is this is unlikely. By having a shared vision, then you've got a base on which to proceed, and you may walk away with a different view of not the non-negotiable aspects of the policy or change, but the negotiable aspects. When's it introduced? How's it introduced? What's the best way for us to implement it? So on and so forth. And then this isn't going to be the last change that you make in the organisation, so you need to think hard about the posture. Did that work well for you? And how do you report back? How do you evaluate how well this is going in a way that is humble and open with the organisation, so that you leave fertile ground behind you for the next change, as opposed to some of the scorched earth that you might see on occasion.
And that evaluation, you sort of agree that the group all agrees with that as well? It's quite consultative as well? That's
right. And Nicola's just made the point, if I jump onto that again, you will break trust if groups are not really heard. So what you want to do is make sure that you're running this DAVE process from the start every time. So it's a good point by Nicola. So if you've got, if you want to think of it as sort of a growing spheres of engagement, you need to run this process every time, and don't segment people based on their views as I'm going to go and talk to that. Because the way that people traditionally manage risk, or at least their personal feelings about the process, is by limiting who they talk to, or going and talking to different groups that have similar views as a group. People need to see what essentially happens on a psychological level when they're put in the room with people with different views.
Okay.
So replaying this process through is critical. So that's how we tend to bring things together to address at least some of those core outrage drivers, which then makes way for that the access to that sort of rational discussion as part of the process. And something that I've found can complement the change management tools that I've used in the past, because it helps you have the conversation throughout, which the change management toolkits don't generally go into.
Okay, great.
Okay. I'll leave this up. This is really what we've covered. First of all, we looked at the change management methodologies that are out there, at least in an academic sense. And there are, of course, some that are in place in different organisations. We heard about one of those today. And then, first of all, understanding. You may find social license useful to understand, which is what that left column is all about, understand what's going on. And then to the right, designing a genuine conversation and process to complement what you're already doing.
That's fantastic. So we've got a little bit of time now, sort of coming up towards the end of the webinar timing now. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to shoot them on through. One question here, I guess, is if there's a real strong culture of resistance in an organisation, will this work on it?
I mean, it's an interesting premise, a strong culture of resistance. So, I mean, so why is that? So I would just say, let's go back to step one, which is, well, what's happening inside the organisation? So you need to understand what that is. And I would suspect a strong culture of resistance is one where there's a disconnect between, going to Paul's point, there might be perceived as a lack of empathy for staff and a lack of appreciation for the views on the floor, and a posture by management that is not amenable to hearing various views, and a posture that is not genuinely consultative. So essentially, it's difficult to have a genuine conversation.
Great. I think that was a great question to sort of close up as we're sort of coming up towards the end of our time now. So Daniel, thank you so much for coming on in and giving us a bit of insight. I do really enjoy learning about Dave. We've used it and adapted and applied it quite often within the National Road Safety Partnership Program and other areas. So I hope any other organisation you have any questions, please feel free to shoot through a query to myself, and I'm happy to pass them to Daniel or go to Daniel directly. We have a blog up as well. Feel free to provide comments on that. So thank you, Daniel. You got any last closing comments you'd like to make?
No, just to say thank you, and I think it's been really fun for me. Really fun.
Excellent. It's all about a good conversation. So thank you all very much. We have a very interesting webinar for next month. We're going to be talking about a bit of a darker topic, suicide in road transport. And this is actually people suiciding onto vehicles and other sort of impacts to heavy vehicles. Anyway, thank you very much again, and I hope you can join us in the future. I stopped it.